panel 2, which deals with a very, very important project that has been going on for the past 7 years. It's a multi-year, multi-author, multi-research project that has involved close to 6 researchers altogether. It's divided into, in fact, 4 parts. The first is the aftershock of the uprising, so Reconstruction, national peace and democratic change. The speaker will be Raimundo Soto, and the discussants are Ibrahim Badawi and Nies Christian Borman. The second part of this overall project is the foundations for post-conflict growth agenda in the Mena region, and the speaker will be Samia Tuman, and the discussant Khalid Abu Ismail. The third part will be the impact of violent conflict on our lives and livelihoods in the Mena region. The speaker will be Tilman Brook, and the discussant Nada Mustafa Ali. And the fourth is economic interdependency and conflict. The speaker is Ahmad Ghunaim, and the discussant Ibrahim Saif. Of course, each project has its own team of researchers, who, as I said, numbered about 30 researchers altogether. I will leave for every team leader to introduce the objectives of the project that he has led, but permit me to highlight very briefly the major overall conclusions of this project. The first conclusion is that whatever form the settlements of the Syrian conflicts in the region take in today's world, and any transformation leading to lasting national peace cannot be achieved except conditionally on laying the foundation for inclusive economic development in the context of a genuinely democratic environment. Furthermore, whatever shape the new social contract takes in each Arab country requires massive transformation of the institutional fabric of society, that is, the set of key institutions that help create the conditions for non-inevitable conflict. The second conclusion is that this institutional transformation, to be successful, would require not only a good understanding of how security and socio-economic trends shape each other, but also the establishment of new tools to forge the peace of economic recovery, which the project identifies. The third conclusion is that the growing economic interdependence among the Arab countries, specifically the role of preferential trade agreements in this regard, necessitates a thorough understanding of both its positive and negative impact on natural conflicts, which the project also identifies. Now, organizationally, the first session is allotted 60 minutes. And I would like to ask Speaker Raimondo to take to 30 minutes for his presentation, and then discuss each up to 10 minutes, with 10 minutes for discussion. For the other 3 sessions, they have been assigned 30 minutes each. Therefore, I propose to give the speaker 15 minutes for his presentation and the discussant 5 minutes, which leaves 10 minutes for discussion. And now with this, I turn the floor to Raimondo to start the first session. Raimondo, the floor is yours.
May I just mention a couple of things, Dr. Samir, please, before Raimondo starts?
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just want to welcome everybody and indicate that the Arabic translation is available. But since we don't have, Zoom doesn't have yet an Arabic button, if you want to follow the Arabic, you need to press on Spanish under the interpretation globe at the right-hand corner. So it's, if you want Arabic, put on the Spanish channel. If you want English, you do the English. If you want it live, you just keep it, stay as you are. الترجمة متاحة بالعربي اللي عايز يتابع بالعربي please to follow على ال Spanish channel. That's one announcement. The announcement الثانية إن ال session is being broadcasted live on the ERF YouTube channel and is being recorded. والannouncement الثالثة and please, if you want to put your questions through when the presentation is in progress, please go ahead through the Q&A session, or during the Q&A session, should you like to have the floor, please just raise your hand. Thanks ever so much, and on to you, Raimondo.
Armando?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, can you see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, let me first walk you through the participants of the project. The names are there. It's a combination of very well-known economists in the region and a couple of economists from UK and US universities and myself from Chile. Before going into the details of the findings of the project, we would like, Samir and myself would like to thank ERF for superb management of the project. They were really very helpful. Relentless support and intellectual guidance from the Ford Foundation. We would like to thank our editor, Isabel Miller, the research assistant that participated, and then the university in which Samir and myself are affiliated, American University in Beirut and Catholic University from Chile. And also the discussants of the paper at two workshops. So we're really very thankful of the significant support that we received during this couple of years. Now let me give you the contents. At this point, the project is a 400-page book. It's a huge monster. I don't have any hope of walking you through the entire book. I'm going to take some of the main contributions of the papers in terms of insights and just be brief and unfair probably to the authors. So the book has an introduction which Samir and myself wrote on the causes and conflict of the premises for reconstruction. And we also have 3 thematic papers, one on the economic agenda for post-conflict reconstruction, one on the reasons for civil wars and the grievances that they are based on by Ana Bodea and Christian Howell, and one on power sharing and peace building by Nick Satanes. And these 3 thematic papers provide an umbrella for the analysis in the country studies. We have 6 papers on country studies, 3 devoted to the case of Syria, where Nader Kabani and Alma Bustati try to understand the causes, the consequences, and the future directions of the conflict. Abu Sadr Afaki and Haimun work on the key issue of ethnic and population divisions on the onset of the civil war. And then Al-Samara, Hamrabet, and Shigabit provide scenario-based forecasts for what would be a path or a possible path out of the conflict in Syria and what it entails in terms of financing and development. And then we have 3 papers, one on Yemen by Mahmoud Al-Iliani, Hiba Hassan, and Irene Martinez. They work on looking at the source of conflict in Yemen, but more importantly, on how to achieve peace building and a post-conflict reconstruction scenario. And similar papers are devoted to the Libyan case by Shahir Saki and co-authors, and also to the Iraqi case, which is not exactly the case of a country in current civil war, but a country where conflict is all over and pervasive. And that paper was written by Bassam Youssef, Morar, and El Yumail. And we conclude with a small chapter that summarizes the main findings, which are already being advanced by Samir in his presentation of this panel. Now, let me first start with what we think is ground zero. The project is forward-looking. We're not trying to understand the causes of the conflict, but mainly to anticipate what would be the probable way out after the peace settlement is there. What is a possible way out to achieve lasting peace and to achieve development and social development also. So we start from the observation that Arab countries have failed to implement inclusive, participative democracies, even though in terms of economic development, they have been doing on average quite well, sustained growth, uneven, of course, some countries are doing better than others. But there is this tension between the economic development on one hand and lack of political participation and representation on the other. And the area is characterized by conflict. All countries have their conflicts, but their recurrence to violence is characteristic. The Arab Spring, in our view, is just a manifestation of an ongoing fundamental transformation of the socio-economic and political order in the region. If you would like to term it as a change in the social contract, it is what we have in mind. And of course, in conflict-affected countries, the four that I have already mentioned, such transformation will not only happen, but it will depend on the nature of the peace settlement. And as Samir mentioned initially, at the beginning of his speech, he said, well, that transformation leading to national peace will be conditional on laying the foundations for an inclusive form of socio-economic development in the context of a genuine democratic environment. So we take this as the goals to some extent of this project is to understand what would these foundations that need to be laid in the different countries, what form would they take, and whether it is achievable or not. So what do we mean by a democratic environment? It's a system of governance where two things happen. One is that society can choose to replace rulers through open, free, and fair elections. And the second, which is as important as the first one, is that rulers are held accountable for their actions. Okay, so this is what we define as a genuine democratic environment. That transformation, we think, is inevitable at the regional level. But in order to be fruitful, they will require massive modernizing reforms. And the papers, both the thematic papers as well as the country studies, look at what modernizing reforms are needed. Therefore, the design of a comprehensive agenda for reconstruction, most of all in these conflict-affected economies, is a must. And one that has to balance two very complicated things. You have to do political reforms and economic reforms so that one reinforces the other and not become a limitation to success. We have a number of stories of political reforms that are stalled by economic limitations, and a lot of economic reforms that have been blocked by political interest. So the combination of the two types of reforms should reinforce each other and propel the country into a new stage of development. Now, such an agenda, of course, ought to be based on a solid and sound diagnosis of what are the conditions, what institutions are present in the country, what policies led to the fracturing of a social contract, so that the reforms actually respond to these conditions and policies, and they would need to be articulated properly to achieve such transformation. So the writing of an agenda for change requires a sound diagnosis and proposals which are tailored to the conditions of each country, and that is the aim of the project and of the book. Okay, now in the introduction of the book, Samir and myself have a small piece with an overview of the underlying factors that cause the discontent and the conflict. And despite the fact that if you look at the sheer numbers, the per capita GDPs and that kind of indicators, there have been sustained growth and improving welfare during the past 20 or 25 years. Nevertheless, we also record that there has been very high rates of unemployment, particularly for the youth, and a high level of inequality in expenditure, in income or in wealth, and a deteriorating supply in terms of quantity or quality of public goods. This, coupled with institutional social factors, including cronyism, corruption, and abuse of power by public servants, all of these are at the root of the conflict, at the root of the uprisings, and at the root of the violent conflict. We also identify challenges for reconstruction after the peace agreement is reached. There is a need for political reforms for governance and for mitigating the risk of recurring violence. Now, this is very complicated to do because you have to instill self-control, political generosity, inner group confidence, trust, where none of this is present. And these should be coupled at the same time with security, improving in security and the disarmament of the fighting factions. Okay, so it's from a political point of view, the challenge is significant. On the economic side, you have to jumpstart the economy. You have to create jobs. You have to create incomes, particularly for the youth, so that the alternative cost of violence increases and the welfare of the population improves. And at the same time, you would like to do this, but implement some reforms, deep economic reforms, that would allow the country for the sustainability of the effort. Now, these two political reforms and economic, these two types of reforms reinforce each other, but reinforce each other sometimes in a virtuous manner and sometimes in a vicious manner. If the population feels and perceives an improvement in the standards of living, the political support will be there for the reconstruction effort. If the economic reforms deliver the fruits, then the political rallying the political consensus will be to support the reforms. There is a vicious cycle in which the population doesn't perceive any improvement in the standard of living, and then the political support collapses. And once the political support collapses, then economic reforms will never be fruitful. Okay, let me walk. So this is a starting point and the assessment of the situation. And let me now walk you through the main takeaways of the thematic papers. And here I chose to be very unfair, because I will give only one slide per paper. We have one too many papers, and you don't want to have anyone outside. So I will give you one slide and probably 2 or 3 at the most key insights, and then I'll move on to the next one. I hope that I can entice you to read the chapters and see the myriad, the enormous number of insights and contributions which are in the thematic papers, and most of all in the country studies. So the first paper by Samir and myself is an economic agenda for post-conflict reconstruction. It's divided the chapter in 2. We identify with more precision what are the key economic, political, and social challenges faced by the post-conflict economies. And we propose policy and institutional reforms to address these challenges. Okay. And it's a very lengthy piece of work, but it has a detailed analysis of each of these proposals. Now, 3 ideas or 3 insights come out of this work. One is that reconstruction policies should be primarily geared towards changing, improving or eliminating, changing the pre-conflict institutional fabric of the country, because that institutional fabric helped creating the conditions for failure. So if you don't change institutions, then there is little hope of improving the current situation. The second one is that if reconstruction policies are to gain legitimacy and be sustainable, they should focus on achieving broader economic inclusion and lessening inequality, in addition to achieving substantial reductions in unemployment, typically and particularly youth unemployment, or what is called the youth bulge. So change the institutions first, but make them to achieve broader economic inclusion and lessening inequality. And the third insight is that these reforms and policies should be in line with the establishment of an implicit or explicit new social contract. We hope in the context of a genuine democratic environment, as I mentioned in the beginning. But we deemed that the existing or the past social contract is no longer functioning, is no longer operational, and you need to create a new social contract, hopefully again, in democratic terms. Then we have the second thematic paper, which is by Anna Bodea and Christian Howell, where they look at the origins of the Civil War. And this is important because what you think is the origin or one of the causes of the Civil Wars actually guides your reform proposals in the end. So they revised the two main contending hypotheses about the source of conflicts and wars. One is based on economic factors, basically the factors that create the opportunity and the economic rent for conflict, which these are generally associated with the greed-based explanations. The other one is a grievance approach, where you look at factors that motivate actors to initiate a conflict. And they test for the role of different factors in explaining the outbreak of a conflict, and they include democratic political institution, political exclusion, economic inequality, the important role of oil in fueling these conflicts, inequality in horizontal terms, both political and economic. And what they find is perhaps not surprising for us, but surprising for the literature. It's not greed or grievance, which is at the root of a conflict, but greed and grievance that are both present at the outbreak of a conflict to a different degree. And therefore, any post-conflict reconstruction agenda must deal with both sources of violence if the post-settlement agreement, the peace agreement, the post-conflict agreement, is to be sustainable, okay? So these two elements should be considered in the political and the economic reforms because both will be able to destabilize the post-conflict agreement, okay? Now, Nixon Banny's work on the power sharing and peace building, which is one way out of a conflict, whereby he looks at what conditions can power sharing institution produce so as to reduce the risk of war recurring. And these power sharing institutions are those that eventually would provide for a mutually acceptable, self-enforcing bargain. And that bargain, if it works, would allow the cost of recurring to violence in order to adjudicate disputes over resources or power. Alternatively, what role is there for different forms of power sharing institutions? What role for an inclusive power sharing institution, which is to allocate different groups of the society access to the central government? Is that a way to go, or should we, or the countries, go in a dispersive type of power sharing institution, which is granting autonomy, policy autonomy, to territorially concentrated groups? And Nick goes not only reviewing the literature, which is very important, but also he tests for different forms of power sharing institutions in the sustainability of peace. And the findings are as follows. He finds that only constrained power sharing has a positive effect on the probability that a democratic arrangement survives. So it's not power sharing all across the board. It must be constrained. And he finds that only inclusive power sharing produces positive outcomes for democratic stability. So granting policy autonomy to territorially concentrated groups is not the way to go. A better way to go would be to allocate access to a central government. But the more extensive the inclusion of former rebels in the power balance, the lower is the commitment of the different parties to that power sharing. So here is an interesting message of include them all, but be careful to what you put inside of your power sharing agreement, because if the positions are too far away one from the other, then there is a weakening of the commitment to keep that power sharing, and therefore there is a chance of recurring violence. Okay, so this is the umbrella. Again, these are very lengthy papers, and I am just giving you some insights in the hope that you would find interesting what is in the rest of the paper. Now, this is the umbrella for the country studies. Let me show you the main takeaways of the country studies. And we have, as I mentioned, 3 papers on Syria. The name of the papers are there and the authors. And if one would like to put together these 3 papers, I think, and this is my way of reading the papers, is Syria epitomizes the collapse of the authoritarian bargain. Okay, this authoritarian bargain is a social contract under which citizens tacitly agree to give up political rights in exchange for public services. By definition, there is no power sharing, or little power sharing and little participation. And these, in time, fuel grievances. Coupling this situation with the reforms initiated by the regime that were not well designed and that were prone to rampant cronyism, these all led to an increase in the perception and in the numbers also, but in the perception of the population of increasing inequality, of lack of accountability, and this led to social unrest. And then we all know about the repressive response of the regime and the discrimination against minorities, and therefore the civil war. So these papers share all these view on a collapsing authoritarian bargain, and then the recommendations to achieve lasting peace and inclusive development is to work on finding, implementing a new social contract that embodies general power sharing. But these 3 papers warn us that the nature of the power sharing will largely determine on how the civil conflict will be settled. Okay, and therefore they're very cautious in terms of suggesting what type of civil conflict, of civil organization will be after the conflict is settled. The second insight that I find interesting and important for us is that second best options for political economic reforms are most likely to be sustainable and effective. Don't go for the best option. Go for what is an option taking care of all the limitations and of all the restrictions that the current situation produces. But nevertheless, these policies, these reform policies, should be transitory and instrumental for the much needed longer term and political transformations that the country requires. And then the papers look also at the reconstruction's needs. And the financing of the reconstruction is way beyond the current means of the government or the future means of the government. So that foreign aid, capital repatriation, workers' repatriation, and mobilization of domestic resources are crucial. But more importantly than that, the papers try to assess the timing of these flows and show that they would have a very different effect whether they occur at different times or at different magnitudes. So basically, you need a new power sharing agreement, a new social contract. Go for second best options in the short run, but move into the long-term preferred policies in the long run. And then be very careful, because the financing of these reforms is way beyond the means of the government, and therefore you need to carefully plan what to do in the future. Yemen, and in this paper by Mahmoud Alibiani and co-authors, Yemen is a very different kind of conflict. It epitomizes the failure of a power sharing agreement. Okay, in 1990, there was when the country unified, the North and the South unified, they went for an equal power sharing arrangement. Okay, and in fact, conflict and distress pushed for a new agreement proposed in 2013 along federal lines that were never implemented. And it was not implemented because a combination of instability, tribalism, lack of a central authority, and warlordism were all sources of conflict, and it went up, it spiraled out, and generated this horrible situation that we are now. Now the paper goes through all the history of the conflict and the lessons that we can learn from the conflict, and in the end, this paper is brave enough to propose a return to the power sharing formula adopted by the National Dialogue Conference in 2013, but never implemented. And that formula postulated a non-sectarian power sharing arrangements that guarantee the inclusion of all segments of the society. Okay. Now, this is, if we would like to put this under the view of Nick Sambanis, this would be a constrained power sharing, whereby they take out religious sectarianism, and they indicate that it should never be part of any future power sharing agreement in Yemen, because that was a source of the problems with the 1990 agreement. And also with an important message: it needs to recognize the de facto authority of local groups in a country where the central authority is really very weak. So there's a message here of looking not only to the optimal type of power sharing agreement, but also the ability of implementing this. And they presume that if agreed upon this proposal, this type of governance should in turn encourage the implementation of growth enhancing and socio-equitable economic policies. Okay. So Yemen actually described very well the failure of a power sharing agreement and the cost that it has, and thus warn us to have a power sharing agreement that is sustainable and self-enforcing. Libya, in the paper by Shahir Saki and two co-authors, actually shows a very different pattern. It's the inability to reverse the progressive disintegration of the nation state. This is a very complicated type of situation. Since the uprising, Libya has suffered from recurring social, political, and economic crisis with the security added to it. Tribalism, ethnic divisions, foreign interventions, everything has reinforced one another in order to generate this very conflictive and society. Now here, at the difference with the difference between this country and Yemen and Syria, this is compounded by oil riches, which are abundant in the Libyan case, and massive foreign intervention. Of course, Syria, the foreign intervention has been very important, but the oil riches is not there. And in the conclusions of this paper, after revising the entire Libyan experience, they would suggest the following: the long-term goal would be to implement a post-conflict transition model. Again, this idea that you cannot go for the first best, you have to go for the second best, and the transition model that would embody an inclusive settlement with balanced power sharing, perhaps along the lines of the Schirat agreement of 2015. They think that this agreement is not feasible in the immediate future, and that a transitional government is needed to bring together the warring parties, to facilitate dialogue on establishing stability as a first step, to be followed by agreements on the form of governance to be adopted nationally by a constitutional referendum. So there is a view here on how to proceed to generate a new social contract and a new feasible agreement. Now, in the case of Libya, they warn us that the support from the international community for reconciliation is a must. It would greatly facilitate a process, which is to say that international community and foreign intervention be guided towards improving the situation in Libya and not other purposes. Finally, we have a paper on Iraq. And the Iraqi case by Bassam Youssef and co-author is, I would term it in the following way. This is my view on the paper. It's not what probably the authors have in mind. And the question in Iraq is, where is plan B when power sharing fails? That would be a way to put the Iraqi case. And what the authors show us is that after the fall of Saddam Hussein, the coalition government wanted to de-Ba'athify, take away the Ba'ath party members from the government, and generate an ethno-sectarian apportionment system between the Sunnis, the Shiites, and other groups. Now, this power-sharing agreement failed and led to a state dismantling and paralysis. And this paper makes a very compelling case for the problems of state paralysis. Subsequent governments were unable to improve matters, and therefore reconstruction has been slowed by state incapacity, apart from other issues such as corruption, institutions, and the like. And they feel that the pressing need to change the current social contract has not been addressed, and the social contract standard in the area is that the state is the employer of first and last resort, and that is unsustainable. It's swallowing up most of the resources of the government, and not in employment and not in other ends. So they have this fantastic idea in mind. There is a central role for the state in meeting this challenge. So they would go for the following idea. The state is the problem, the state is the solution. Just that the first state, when the state is a problem, is not the same state as the state when the state is a solution. So you need to change the institutions in the state. And that is precisely what the message of the paper is. This, giving a central role to the state, need not constrain the development of a private sector that is much needed. They also think that changing the working and the institutionality of the state would allow for a fair distribution of oil resources that will be desirable in terms of fairness, but also because horizontal equality is likely to reduce the chance of a conflict and will allow, therefore, to promote capital formation and development. So that the present policy of distributing public sector jobs among different groups, most of the time to the best connected rather than the most qualified, is not only inequitable, but also unsustainable, okay? So this Iraqi paper allows us to think or compel us to think about what role for the state and what type of state is needed for the reconstruction process. Okay? Finally, we in writing this research and putting together the book, COVID, of course, struck us very heavily. So all the chapters were required to include an analysis of the impacts of COVID-19. And of course, it has been a hard blow to the prospects for peace and sustainability of development in Arab countries. Health issues are well known. The economic downturn has been felt by all countries. The disrupted fiscal stance will be felt in the future. Public debt rising and massive fiscal deficits, a heavy toll on marginalized populations, and a collapse of public services. How much of these are transitory and how much of this is permanent is a key issue that will is not covered necessarily in the papers, but will most likely shape the way in which these countries approach the post-conflict period. Now, Samir and I, we are optimists about everything in this world. And we think the pandemic is also an opportunity for much needed economic, political, and institutional reforms. And there is evidence elsewhere, not in the MENA region, but elsewhere, that this pandemic has allowed for a rising support for central authorities in the short run, even if there is an increase in power concentration in the long run, because this short-term support for the government improve on governance. And there is evidence from the previous and most deadly pandemic in the world, which is the Black Plague in the 1400s, that the pandemic, being such a huge shock, led to changes in the social and institutional fabric of Europe that in the longer run allowed for democratic institutions to appear and flourish. Of course, the long run here is a couple of centuries, and we cannot wait that long for change to come. But still, there is this message that a pandemic is a potential for improving on democratic, economic, and institutional fabrics. That's it for me. I don't want to take more time than you have very generously given to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raimondo. Dr. Samir? Dr. Samir, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Raimondo, thanks for this detailed and precise description, analysis of what the project was all about. And now I would like to give the floor to the two discussants, Brahim and Niels. But may I ask them, we are running a little bit behind time, may I ask them to take less than minutes each, if they don't mind? Brahim?
5 minutes?
Well, that would be good.
You said 5 or 10 minutes? Sorry, I can't.
Between 5 and I leave it to you. Between 5 and 10, Brahim.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will take probably just 5 minutes. I just wanted to say that this is a very insightful set of work, and Samir and Raimondo did an excellent job coordinating this rather complex project. And I would just like to say that probably thinking, this is also reflecting my own future interest, but I think it might resonate more widely, is that in the context of the Middle East region, we need to think a little bit more about the role of social diversity or social polarization in influencing not only the development and especially growth prospects, but also the likelihood of a viable political settlement, including power sharing, which I'm sure my colleague Nils is going to speak to in a much more expert, from a much more expert perspective, But I would like to make the observation in terms of comparing. Obviously, brutal dictatorship that is bad enough, but the dictatorship of a minority insecure ethnic group can be quite serious, for the following reasons. If you think about the revolutions that happened in Iran and Romania and in Sudan 3 times now, and also in Egypt, the powers that be, the authoritarian regime, were not able to actually maintain the cohesiveness of the army to actually, respond in a very sustained and massive force, as opposed to what has happened in Syria, for example. And I think this has a very deep-seated reason. Is because despite all this kind of facade and the claim to Arab nationalism and so on, if you think deeply about the regimes, the vast regime in both Iraq and Syria, the real support of that regimes, at least it transformed over time to become a deeply sectarian authority where the instruments of violence can be actually quite cohesive and continue to actually remain intact and impose extreme violence in response to popular uprising. And this makes things very difficult, not only for resuming growth after the war is over or after the violence is over, but I think actually also for forging a meaningful settlement. I will just cite the example of the lessons drawn from a paper that I did with my colleague Norman Loaiza on Syria after growth in Syria after war, where we used a growth model, a long-term growth model that is very simple but quite transparent, that depends on clear assumptions of high relevance to the case of Syria, which is the repatriation of refugees and the extent to which the international community is willing to support, to finance the reconstruction. And we came up with 3 scenarios. It is a pessimistic scenario of the de facto situation, which is basically that the de facto situation is that the regime basically managed through exercise of extreme violence and support from regional and international allies to actually crush the uprising, which became later on, unfortunately, also a militarized uprising. And there is the other scenario of what we call the sushi plus, which is a moderate scenario, which is based on the sushi agreement between the 3 countries, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, in order to provide some sort of assurances to those segments of society in Syria that were opposed to the regime and they happen to be the most affected by the violence perpetrated by the regime, such as the micro security of families, communities, and the properties, and so on and so forth, but no political rights to speak of. And then the other one is the Geneva, inclusive kind of political settlement. And if you think about the promise that the Geneva present, in only 10 years, according to our estimation, is that Syria will be able to recover to the pre-2010 level of income and GDP, while it will take 30 years under the moderate scenario of the social plus. And for the de facto one, God knows that it's going to be, according to our estimate, I don't remember, maybe 50 years or 40 years or something. It's just so. Yet, because of this situation, the difficulty to break the cycle, not the cycle, the insecurity, and to provide the credible assurances to the minority that they will actually do well or be fine under an inclusive settlement, there is no chance that actually the current regime, in fact, the current regime already went ahead and did an election that is very clear does not represent anything. But chances are in other situations, other contexts, civil war may not happen, just like what happened in Iran, where the army sided with the rebellious population. In Sudan happens 3 times. And this is the reason being is because the power that be will not be able actually to sustain a very violent campaign while maintaining the cohesiveness of the army. And I think this is an issue that I know is very sensitive, but I think it is very important to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Dr. Samir, would you like to come in? You're on mute.
Yes, I'm going to thank you very much, Ibrahim, for your insightful comments, and I now give the floor to Niels for his comments on the paper, on the presentation. Niels, go ahead.
Niels, you're on mute.
Where is he, Shireen?
He left completely. He left
Yes,
completely.
he's disconnected.
Oh, so he was in now, just now.
He was in a moment ago. He must have been disconnected. Are there any questions that?
Where is he, by the way? Where is he talking from? Niels.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly in the moment you asked me,
Yes.
it broke down. Anyway, my name is Niels Christian Bormann. I'm professor of international political studies at Witten-Herdecke University in Germany, and I'm very grateful to be here and provide a little bit of feedback on the paper by Nicholas Sambanis. I do a lot of research on power sharing, and I will try to be very short. I have a very short presentation here because I have some graphs. I'm not quite sure if you see the full screen now.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I will try to get to the point very quickly. What is power sharing? I will skip that because Raimundo has already explained that now. What are the conditions for power sharing? And Nicholas Sambanis says there are numerous causes that are discussed in the literature, and we really need to find out which ones are decisive. And what are the consequences of power sharing? And I think of the two types of power sharing that are mostly discussed in the literature, inclusive power sharing, where you bring members of different social groups into the central government or into central government institutions, is likely to reduce the risk of conflict. But taking away power sharing, especially in the context of autonomy or dispersive power sharing, is really going to increase your risk of conflict. And I think that jibes a little bit with what you said about the second best solution. Don't promise too much initially and then reduce it because you cannot deliver. I think building up high expectations in a post-conflict situation, if it's Syria, if it's Iraq, in some case, you could still think it's a post-conflict case, Yemen or Lebanon, Libya, is going to be very problematic if you cannot deliver on these promises. So I think taking away things that are promised will be very difficult. I do want to point out an important distinction that I encountered in my own work, and that is the distinctions between power sharing institutions and power sharing practice. There is a lot of evidence now that we have institutions that work, but these are extremely rare. And here, this is the data set by Graham et al. That Nicholas discusses in detail. This is inclusive power sharing in their data set and the distribution over country years. And you see that both in dictatorships and democracies, there's very little inclusive power sharing, if anything at all. And that means that any results you find with respect to that will depend very much on modeling choices because there's so little information. In contrast, if you turn to power sharing practice, that is actual coalitions of leaders of ethnic groups in this context in the central government, you find on the gray bars here, about half of all the countries in the world are ruled by multi-ethnic coalitions that are sometimes including even all of the groups in the country. And then about another half or so is ruled by minority or majority single group governments, that nation states and exclusive regimes we sometimes have. So that's very important to take that difference into account. On the conditions for power sharing, which I think is quite important to see what works, I believe Nicholas was a bit modest in the paper because his work really shows, and the work of several other political science economists, that United Nations unbiased peacekeeping missions can make a difference. So if there's any chance of bringing in an unbiased neutral peacekeeping mission, that might really improve the effectiveness of power sharing and the stability of post-conflict peace. There are still problems that we shouldn't deny, but I cannot go into them right now. What's really problematic for both power sharing and post-conflict peace is biased or one-sided support. I'm going to skip the graph here, but what I'm going to tell you is that during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States backed up particular regimes, we had far more exclusive regimes, we had far more civil wars, and a lot of them got resolved after the Cold War. Nicholas points that out. And that is part because we had more UN peacekeeping missions, but partially because outside support was withdrawn. And regimes couldn't count on outsiders anymore to back them up, even if they were in the minority in their own country. And I think that's highly important for Libya, for Syria, and to some extent to Iraq, of course, with the influence of Iran, to think about how can we bring these outsiders to a table and kind of let them withdraw their support for the various factions that are fighting in the country or that have fought in the country, because that is highly destabilizing. And let me end on the consequences of power sharing. And here I want to stress a little bit of somber note. And what you see here is work on the left on ethnic exclusion, which is the opposite of inclusion, so the opposite of power sharing. On the right, you see autonomy. And we've seen over the last 30 years a massive expansion of power sharing around the world, in particular in blue here in sub-Saharan Africa, where ethnic exclusion has massively dropped. We see an increase to some extent in autonomy, though not as much. But the one region that is really lacking behind in terms of power sharing is the MENA region. And this is data only till 2013 that we worked on in response to the Arab Spring. But I've checked the data, I just didn't have the time to update the graphs. This is pretty much the situation today. The Middle East and North Africa, in this region here in turquoise, is still the most ethnically exclusive region in the world, and is still the region with the lowest level of dispersive power sharing or territorial autonomy for particularly sectarian groups. So that is really, really important, because before we discuss the consequence of power sharing, it needs to be set up in the first place. And I think my plea is to really think about what are also informal ways in which we can do that before we set up constitutions that take years to write, kind of the first best solution. What are informal ways in which we can incentivize people who fought each other, who've killed each other, to come to the same table? And I think that's really important to think about before we then can think about the positive consequences that power sharing might have. Thank you so much. I will now
Thank you.
drop this.
Thank you, Niels. But may I ask you a question right away? The reason, do you discuss the reasons why power sharing is so low in the MENA region? Do you go into that?
So we only speculate. We don't really have good information on that. And there's two mechanisms that we are speculating about. So one is that the MENA region continues to be, and has been for a very long time, a region where outside powers, in particular, of course, the United States, have massively backed up local regimes for the good and for the bad, right? I think everyone has their different stat points what this does, but there's been massive transfers of support to governments in the region, which I believe lessens the degree of pressure these degrees have to opening up to their societies, to build a dialogue with their societies and minority groups. A second reason here is, of course, and that affects only part of the MENA region, is the massive oil wealth, which makes these regimes impervious to pressure by civil society because they control the revenues from oil. But that is not something that necessarily stands in the way in Syria or in Yemen, where I think if outsiders could be brought to a table where peace conference could be brought about, that outsiders are stopping to back their preferred faction, their preferred government, or find a way to encourage the people they have encouraged to fight to step it down a little bit, that could have a massive influence. So Saudi Arabia needs to be pressured in that case, of course, in the case of Syria, Iran, Russia, but also various other Arab states. And yeah, these are the two mechanisms which I believe have made it less important or have reduced the pressure on governments in the region to open up. And unfortunately, these are tricky issues.
Thank you very much, Niels, for this presentation of yours. And now I would like to open the floor for discussion, questions, but I'm afraid we are not going to go more than 10 minutes for discussion. So all those who have questions to ask, please, or comments to make, please go ahead. Do you hear me? Am I heard?
Yes, Dr. Samir. I can't see questions in the Q&A. There aren't any questions there. There's one hand raised. Just give me 1 second. In the attendee.
I cannot see it. You can see it. Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Nader Qabbani.
Yeah. Okay. You want to ask a question?
Yes, Dr. Nader.
Thank you very much. Samir, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, many thanks to everyone, and especially to Raimondo for managing in a very short period of time to summarize key insights from a very large volume of work. I have one question, because I mean, a lot of the things he did extremely well in terms of summarizing the main findings. One question to you, Dr. Samir and Raimondo, is about institutions. And if I understood correctly, you're suggesting that it is preferable to kind of rebuild institutions than to try to reform existing ones. And it seems like both options are very difficult. Reforming institutions that are ingrained with corruption, they're falling apart, seems almost insurmountable. At the same time, when we talk about rebuilding or building new institutions, my mind kind of goes to places like Afghanistan and South Sudan, where there was an attempt to kind of build new institutions that I think by most objective measures had also failed miserably. And I wonder if you could reflect on that, on the idea of building new institutions and whether there is some sort of middle path. Thank you very much.
Dr. Samir, you're on mute, and Dr. Khaled Abu Ismail would like the floor.
Okay, okay, Khaled, go ahead, Khaled.
It's just very quickly, thank you very much. A very fascinating discussion, but I just have one very simple question, and especially in the Syrian context, which I also made note of in the intervention I will give shortly. What about sanctions when discussing the future? I mean, there are many other issues that one can sideline, but really when we know the direct impact of sanctions and the political economy narrative that will play out in state building capacities in particular, not to mention the direct and indirect impacts it has on derailing health and education performance. How can we deal with this issue? I didn't hear anything from the Raimondo's presentation on that. So I would just like to hear your reflections on this very tricky issue, which we're also grappling with here in UNESCO. Over to you.
Thank you, Khaled. Any other questions, Irene?
No, I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay, Raimondo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I first of all, thank you very much for the comments. They will certainly be very useful for the work ahead on this project. Some of these comments are extremely good. I went very light on the paper. Some of these things are discussed in the papers, of course. Ibrahim's point on social polarization is there. There are no discussions in the paper beyond the anecdotal kind of evidence regarding the cohesiveness of the army or the need for support of minority and minority dominance. And it would be an interesting angle to add to these papers, but I'm in no position to say whether this or other issues should be added. But the point is well taken. The same happens a little to me with Khalid's recent comment on Syria and the other countries applies as well. I mean, sanctions are there from a descriptive, analytical point of view, but there is very little in the book on the perspective for the role of sanctions or lifting sanctions once the peace agreement is settled. So it is a key issue, but it's not covered. Now, regarding Niels and another comment, regarding Niels, I completely agree with him that building high hopes for democratic achievements and economic reforms and institutional improvements, it's a suicidal way to go, because the capacities to undertake all the reforms and the likelihood of success of these reforms is limited. So second best options, in my view, are far more appealing way to go. Now he has two other points. One I think is very important, and we tend to fall into this trap of looking at formal arrangements, institutions, power sharing, everything too formal, and forgot a little about the practice of this. The book has a lot of comments on the practice of it, and I didn't highlight them, but it's crucial to be very clear that a formal agreement may not have a practical implication, and the practical agreement may be far more delivering than a formal agreement that, as Neil said, might take, I don't know, years to be written down in the form of a constitution or a legal body. So that's an important insight, and I really would like to thank you, Niels, for that. Now, Nalo made a point, and I'm closing with this, about the options of rebuilding institutions and reforming institutions based on whatever is existent. And here perhaps another way to look at the same would be to use this dichotomy by Acemoglu and Jim Robinson, which is say, look at the nature of these institutions. Some of them are just extractive institutions, trying to generate a rent to be given to the powers in charge, to the elites, to certain groups, to political supporters, vis-a-vis inclusive institutions whereby the generated wealth and rents and reputation are spread among the population. So if you would like to think along these lines, maybe you have to rebuild from scratch institutions that were of an extractive nature and improve and reform those that were inclusive. And that would allow you to have sort of a taxonomy of which institutions to reform and which ones to rebuild. But I agree with him that it's very complicated to go to anticipate which institutions need to be reformed or rebuilt. And again, thanks for pointing out that in real life, reforms are far more complicated than when they appear in the discussion of researchers and scholars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raimundo. I think it's a good point. It's a good, both the excellent points that have been raised in the discussion. Now,
Dr. Samir, if I may,
yes.
Before moving into the next session, I just need to bring your attention. Dr. Mohammed El-Dahshan had a question in the Q&A, yes, and he's also got his hand raised. Yes. And there's also a couple of questions from Dr. Barbara Shenstone. So I'm giving the floor to Dr. Dahshan, and if Dr. Barbara would like the floor, if she can kindly raise her hand, or we can address the questions that have been put forward.
Yes, but kindly as brief as possible, because we are running out of time. So please let the questions go
they're
ahead.
both coming in to put their questions forward.
Sure, okay.
Dr. Dahshan.
Thank you so much for that opportunity. Thank you for an excellent panel that I was looking forward to since the beginning of the conference. My name is Mohammed Dahshan. I'm affiliated with Oxcon, which is a policy consulting firm, and Chatham House in London. My question concerns an issue that I am personally interested in, which is the development of the local private sector to support post-conflict transitions. Most of the interventions and policies we think of look more into attracting foreign investment. And we know by experience that foreign investment to post-conflict countries tends to go to the same 3-4 sectors, construction, banking, mobile telephony, etc. And there's usually not enough attention given to the development of the local small and medium enterprises, shall we say. So what are the policies that you would recommend that a country undergoing a post-conflict transition implement to support its own local homegrown private sector? I would love to hear the thoughts of the panelists and the audience. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Mohammed. There's another comment. Can we do that? Jareen?
Yes, Barbara, would you like to come in?
Hello. Yes, I'm with the International Development Research Center. I wrote my question in the comment. It seems to me there's a distinction to be made between power sharing solutions that might be ideal with a, even with a sound basis of analysis of the reality on the ground and the history, etc. And those that the parties to a conflict are actually able to agree to or are willing to take on at the time of a peace settlement. I wonder if you have any reflections on this. And the other one was about identity politics. I know that the discussion has been about greed and about grievances, but it seems to me when a conflict, I mean, it's not just me, I mean, the literature sustains this, when a conflict really reaches existential dimensions, i.e. one group fears annihilation by the other, the whole issue of trust and peace has reached a completely different level of complexity and difficulty, because fundamentally the risks of being wrong about one group's trust of the other are seen as fatal. So they're much more likely to revert to mistrust than they might have been if they had never reached, a level of violence that became existential. And I wonder if in the considerations of these papers, there are reflections on this. That's all.
Thank you, Barbara. Raimundo, quickly, let's have some comments. Raimundo?
Sure. Well, these are the last two comments are very powerful. Let me go first to Mohammed's question about what is in the book for the development of the local private sector. The country studies do cover aspects of the development of the local private sector and moving the private sector away from the war economy to the productive kind of economy. And also there are some comments and discussion about the resilience of the private sector during the conflict. Now, in the thematic paper, Samir and myself, we touch upon the need to provide for an environment where the local private sector, not those that are being blessed by foreign direct investment, the local private sector would develop. And this requires first to assure the private sector that the rewards to their effort is not taxed away or expropriated by the central government. So there is an important section on property rights and how to make these property rights a viable alternative for the private sector. Also, the deregulation of a number of areas in which the private sector can provide for services, being a competitive environment, it would not lead to monopoly or abuse by the private sector. And then there is an area covering those cases in which the private sector needs to be properly regulated and efficiently regulated. So we have considerations regarding the development of the local private sector beyond these sectors that are to some extent available for foreign direct investment and technology transfer and the like. Of course, we can write a 400-page book on what to do with the local private sector, but it's not the goal of the project. Now, Barbara, well, the two questions are very important. Identity politics, in the way that she put it, when you fear annihilation by other groups, certainly is a more extreme case. We don't have that in the book exactly, although it's lurking in the writing that some of this power sharing that we are suggesting as an alternative way out of the conflict is certainly weakened if the situation is such that the parties are not willing to go to the table for anything, or that you fear annihilation by another group. So it's there, but it's not explicit discussed. It might be a good idea perhaps to dig a little further in whether this is the case or not, or how to get out of this situation before moving into other type of reform. Very good questions, both. actually. The three of them. Mohammed's also a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. Ibrahim, you want to say something very quickly?
Yes.
Yeah, just a 30-second follow-up. I think what Barbara said resonates very well with what I wanted to say, but maybe I didn't say it in a coherent way. I think it is interesting to research when a peaceful popular uprising descend or deteriorate into a violent confrontation and a civil war, as opposed to a relatively peaceful regime change, or just simply, the popular uprising dissipate away or succeed or fail. I think this has obviously influenced by multifaceted factors, but I think the social makeup of society is very important in this, and this actually is very prominent, explaining this phenomena in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all these comments that are extremely important and useful, and we both, Raymond and I, would take them into account. But now we have to move on, and I'm going to be asking Samih. Sorry for it.
Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi will be presenting the first part in place of Samih. Yes.
Oh, he's not with us, Samih?
No, Dr. Ibrahim will be presenting on his behalf.
Okay, Ibrahim, 15 minutes max.
No, actually 15 minutes is too much for this, because I don't have actually the group responsible for this component of the research. They sent me just kind of general comments, general statements, recommendations, and hopefully Khalid is going to articulate this in much more detail. So I'm just going to maybe read off a few relevant paragraphs from the main findings of the research. I think this is a very innovative and very interesting component of research that I think I saw at least one very important presentation by a political scientist back in Harvard 5 years ago or so, at a conference honoring Professor Robert Bates of Harvard, and one of his former students used satellite imagery as an instrument for economic factors in a political science model. Obviously also this has been applied, this use of the satellite imagery has been also used in several work in economics to proxy for the quality of public services, and also for growth and so on. And so this component of the research is aimed at augmenting the deficiency of data on national and regional growth, and it covers the countries of Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, the same case studies, and looked at using the GIS, based satellite data and GIS-based estimates, and looked at the impact of conflicts and the cost of conflicts by comparing the intensity of light in cities as well as in the whole country before and after the conflicts. And it turns out that there is very significant evidence. For example, taking the city of Aleppo, because of the bombardment and the air raids and so on. And this is really the economic capital of Syria, where major industries has been very vibrant and thriving before the war. And it shows the intensity of light is, the significant kind of decline in the intensity of light. And it's correlated with other data and shows that there is significant correlation. And basically, the idea here is to actually reinforce and you know the analysis that has been done in the case studies, as well as in other research. And I think the ESCOA reports and research has strongly emphasized methodologies and analytical aspects of looking at the impact of the deterioration in infrastructure as a result of the war and the capital stock, and the same also, you know, Norman Loaiza and I did in our paper for Syria. So I think this is a very useful complementary approach that allows not just to look at the nationwide depletion of the infrastructure as a result of war, but also to look at the subnational, you know, impact of war, because you know, in all of these countries, despite that the economy suffered an overall destruction and what have you, but some regions have actually sustained much significant destruction than others. And so this has implications for the design of the reconstruction agenda, and it also, I think, could also figure into the design of the power and wealth sharing. For example, you know, in the case of Sudan, even though we have yet to do this, you know, the satellite imagery analysis, but certainly some regions have been much more affected by the war than others. So I think this is a very promising and interesting approach. This component of research also discussed the need to have a political context and political settlement and so on and so forth, which basically, you know, I wouldn't say replicate, but basically is overlap with the presentation that Raimundo has already presented in terms of the, you know, the post-conflict agenda and reconstruction. So I think, for the interest of time, I feel these are the most important aspects of what was sent to me to present on behalf of the authors of this dimension or this segment of the research. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim, and thank you, Samir. This is still an ongoing project, right, Ibrahim? This is still an ongoing project. It's not ended. The project is still ongoing.
Yes, no, but I think it is already, we have the drafts. It's not yet published, but I think we do have the drafts already.
All right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. All right, then I will turn now to any other comments that Agali made.
I think we need to move on to Dr.
Okay,
Khaled.
Khaled.
Yes. Okay, let me also give some quick reflections based on the material that was sent to me. I'll try to be very brief in the interest of time. And let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see it now?
Perfect. You want to make it into a full screen, if you
Yes, want. Like this.
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, so I have like 4 or 5 quick reflections on the issue itself of the foundations for post-conflict growth. And let me start by foundation number 1, or stylized fact number 1. And that is basically that we all know, and I think Raimondo also mentioned, that conflict is not going away from this region. It's going to be around, unfortunately, for a while. So we need to better understand the impact and the impact assessment. That ties in very nicely, of course, with what Ibrahim was saying earlier. And if you just want to have a rough order of magnitude of the impact of the conflict, all you need to do is to look at this very simple extrapolation at the regional level of the impact on the Human Development Index, in the absence of conflict in those 4 countries and with conflict. In the absence of conflict, we would have been in the group of high human development category countries or a region. We're still in the middle human development category. So there's no doubt about the fact that, unfortunately, we're going to be stuck with these questions about how to measure conflict. And here, I fully agree with what Ibrahim said, the need for innovative estimates, GIS-based or otherwise, phone surveys. I mean, and I have to say that this has really been very helpful for us also in the ESQA project. The satellite imagery, however, is a necessary but insufficient prerequisite for giving a narrative on the ground. At least I'm speaking from the experience of ESQA. In order for us to give narratives that are more sub-regional and maybe even go at the sub-governorate level, you need to have an infrastructure on the ground. You need to have groups of NGOs, there were about 250 people who were working with us on a constant basis in order to inform these satellites. But so I fully agree that that is a very important part of the story. One thing I have to say, though, that was very helpful, that because we had a CGE infrastructure, it allowed us also to make meaningful, quick impact assessment. But the more, as we all know, the more distant you are from the initial year of having the SAM and the data, the more difficult it becomes to justify the results. Second point, which I didn't see much discussion about, is that we're all talking about conflict, but we're really not spending enough time and effort about measuring conflict itself. And I think this is an issue that I personally have become more interested in. I'm not going to get into the details of a suggestion I'm working on, but let's say that we skip out of the more subjective expert-based assessments and we just focus on the quantitative observational data like the frequency of conflict, battle-related deaths, IDPs and refugees, okay? And let's make an assessment of where this region stands. And this is a categorical index, basically from 1 to 5. It follows like the Global Peace Index. 5 means very high intensity conflicts. 0 means basically you don't have a conflict. No? And these are the scores that we have for 2019. And basically out of the countries that have scored globally more than 2.5, you have 1/3 almost from the region. So unfortunately, this region, the stylized fact is that we have become the face of conflict globally. And that's, of course, a very alarming stylized fact. More alarming is the fact that when you look at this DCI score changes from 2000 to 2019, the majority of countries that have had a positive score increase, in other words, reflecting an increase in intensity of conflict, are from the region. So not just in terms of level, but we're also in terms of the increase in intensity of conflict. Now, as you would expect, this index correlates with the Global Peace Index, okay? So, and it correlates also with the absence of violence and terrorism index, as you can see here. It also correlates with the governance index. And regardless, we've tried this with any governance. You can use the World Bank, varieties of democracies, a mixture of both. And even more so when you focus specifically on the human rights and freedoms dimensions of the governance issue. That's a very important remark, especially when we're talking about the grievances issue. Of course, I don't want to enter into these debates here, but I just wanted to highlight that these issues are important. They're staying with us. And I think there's a need going forward. I think there is a need to invest a little bit more on the methodological side. But let me end my intervention, since I was told to speak for 5 minutes only, with 3 specific areas I think that we need to pay attention to. First of all, definitely the IDPs, internally displaced persons, and the refugees are a problem, and it's certainly more of a problem in countries like Lebanon, lesser extent maybe in Turkey, Jordan. These are issues that could drive further conflict in the future if we're not careful about how to handle them. And they require special kinds of surveys, special kind of assessment techniques. This second issue, which I think needs more attention, especially when we're talking about Syrian's case in particular, is the issue of sanctions. It's not clear how we can deal with this. It's a very difficult issue to deal with because you cannot isolate, for example, the impact of sanctions on development from other forces around. But there's one thing for sure, is that the direct and indirect impacts of sanction in Syria are much more significant than purported, and especially in sectors where they're not supposed to have an impact on the general population, like, for example, the health sector, mainly because of their second round effects from the financial sanctions and the difficulty of procurement and otherwise. The third issue, which I found also surprising, Dr. Ibrahim and Professor Samir, that was missing from the narrative on Foundations for the Future, is the regional perspective. I really personally don't think that enough attention has been given to the possibility of using regional integration. I'm not talking here about the Arab region, pan-Arab view. No, I'm simply talking about, integration solutions, economic integration solution, or even economic openness between the Turkey, Iran, and the Levant, so to speak, and looking at the impact of the economic openness and economic integration on growth of the future. I think this carrot has not been fully estimated, the size of the gains that would come. And given the situation that we're in, maybe the incentive could become significant enough to actually drive the future discussions of a political solution, which Dr. Ibrahim ended with. Finally, that's my final comment. We need to have, and I think this was mentioned by Ramad, we need to have a better understanding of the conflict drivers, and this is something that I think would require a lot more, not just technical work, but also discussion, policy dialogues, dialogues with different fractions of the impacted society, and so forth. Because even with a country that I personally, for example, have worked with, like Syria, I still find the elements of the narrative that you mentioned, Raimondo, where you're emphasizing really the authoritarian bargain. I think it's maybe has been overstated. I mean, again, these are issues that we will continue to discuss, but I think more work on the conflict drivers, on the narrative of the root causes of conflict is key in order for us to move forward. I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Professor Samir.
Thank you very much, Khaled. These are very, very interesting, in fact, and provocative points that you have raised. Very, very interesting indeed, Khaled. Okay, now we devote 10 minutes for discussion, questions, comments.
There's one question from Dr. Mahmoud Haddad, and I'm giving him the floor.
Mahmoud Hamad of the US.
Mahmoud Haddad.
Of the United States of America.
Dr. Mahmoud, you have the floor. You want to unmute, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Mahmoud, yes.
Good morning. Good morning from my side. Good evening or good afternoon from your side. It was nice listening to all of these very constructive and educational for me, because I'm not into peace and war and conflicts in a sense of the economic part of it. But I got, in my views, what does conflict has? Does conflict has any positive economic impact? The post-conflict, the conflict itself, does it have any positive economic impact on any given nation that ever happened? One of my friends and colleagues who have done or applied the option pricing model on a lot of the conflicts. And in most of these cases, we find out that all of these conflicts really are what we call probably is put call, rather than a call option is a put option rather than a call option, meaning it always ends up to a destruction rather than a positive impact later on in any given nation. I don't know if anybody can elude it to. Can you find any conflict, whether external or internal, meaning that whether within the country or probably brought from neighbors or other countries, whatever, does it have any impact on any of the conflict parties? Thank you very much.
Mahmoud, any other comments? Shireen?
Yes,
Shireen?
Raimondo would like to have the floor as well.
Yeah, okay. Raimondo?
Thank you. Thank you. Since Khalid threw the ball at me, I'm going to throw back the ball at him with a minor comment. But I am all for regional integration in economic terms and perhaps even more. But I will warn you that it's great, but don't expect much out of it. And the empirical evidence of trade integration and market integration, at least that I know of, is that the gains are small in terms of creating new businesses and creating new wealth and providing for jobs. And one reason for that, at least in the Middle East, is that there are two things that caution us to expect some improvement, but not much. One is that the cost of negotiating integrations are really very high because of the vested interest of different groups that would eventually be affected by integration, right? So the more vested interests are, the cost of setting up these integration, regional integration schemes are more complicated. And the second thing is that the welfare is directly proportional, the welfare gain is directly proportional to the dissimilarity between economies that are trading and integrating. And the area is roughly very similar, okay? So perhaps the integration in the region would bring out some welfare improvements, will bring out more work, more jobs, more economic activity, but don't expect it to be sort of the silver bullet that will change matters radically. Thank you.
Thank you, Raimondo. Khalid or Brahim, would you like to briefly address the two comments from Mahmoud and Raimondo? Hello?
Dr. Ibrahim, you want to go first?
Please go first.
Okay, I mean, yes, we know that conflict has a positive impact on some groups, and there are, very well known cases of groups who benefit from conflict, but they are a significant minority. The fact is, Syria had, if you use the same poverty line, Syria had a poverty rate of around maybe 12 to 14% prior to conflict. And if you use that same poverty line, now around 50, 60 at least % of the population are poor. You use a higher poverty line, the rate goes up to 80%. So the vast majority loses. Neighboring countries, you can argue that maybe in the short term, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey may have benefited from the initial wave of refugees and settlers. They had some savings, particularly the higher income that went to places like Jordan. But over time, I'm not so sure. In fact, one of the main concerns of these countries right now is that the lingering conflicts in Syria and is really, producing significant economic impact, and especially when it comes to trade routes. And that takes me to the second issue, which is, yes, you're absolutely right, Raimondo. Under normal circumstances, this region, for exactly the same reasons that you've mentioned, trade gains are very small. But after the conflict, after you've practically turned some countries into, LDCs from their upper or middle income status, and after you've, the economic diversification has changed dramatically, the human capital differences have changed. I see a case for that. Now, if maybe 10 years ago with the vested interest, you're absolutely right. And yes, there are going to be, issues related to embedded autonomy. There are definitely going to be groups that we're going to lose out of this. But regimes are also interested in their own survival. And, with the rents declining because of the current situation, this could be, I'm not saying that this should be the way to think, but this could be a way for getting more gains. But in the process also, opening doors for redevelopment and reconstruction. And so I'm not saying that this is the panacea, but all I'm saying is that it hasn't been explored. The question has not even been assessed yet. Maybe we should pay more attention to it. Over to you.
Thank you, Khalid. Brahim, anything you would like to add?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I agree with Raimundo that regional integration is difficult and takes away a lot of time. But I think if one takes into consideration the impact that regional integration is really about economic interdependency, and to the extent that countries are interdependent economically, I think that creates a whole set of externalities that may not be captured directly, such as, for example, making the opportunity cost of peace between countries to be extremely high. And so countries tend to work hard to avoid conflicts among them, as well as conflict within them. And I think that's definitely an important consideration. I think, for example, should the three countries of the Nile, the Blue Nile Basin, or the Nile Basin, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, they actually happen to have considerable interdependency in terms of infrastructure and industry and all types of, it will make it very hard. There will be considerable pressure on all the governments of the three countries to find a solution out of any conflictive approach to resolving conflict, to resolving the disagreements. The same thing in the Maghreb countries. The conflict or the disagreement between Algeria and Morocco has really set back a huge potential for regional cooperation in that region, and also perpetuated the conflict in Western Sahara. So I think this is definitely an issue that need further analysis and multidisciplinary analysis, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I'm afraid we have to move on. Time is pressing, and I'm going to be asking Tillman to talk on the impact of violent conflict on lives and livelihoods in the Mena region. Tillman, 15 minutes would do.
Dr. Samir, while Tillman is presenting, may I just bring Dr. Khalid Abu Ismail's attention to a question from Dr. Huda Abu Bakr, whom he can respond to in the Q&A section in writing.
Okay, fine. Okay, Khalid, do that.
Sure, noted, Shireen, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Is Tillman with us?
Yes, I am. Can you see my screen properly? I hope I'm set it up correctly.
Yes.
Yeah, I hope you only see the slides and not the presenter mode.
Very small
Okay.
slide, very small though. The font is very small.
The font,
Can
then
we
it's
make
not.
it into full screen, please?
Yes, then
Because we
that's
see
what I was worrying, that I'm showing the wrong screen. Is this better?
Perfect.
Yeah, yes.
Okay,
yes.
then I've swapped the screens. Thank you for pointing that out. Otherwise, okay. So thank you, everybody, Samir and Ibrahim and the great team at ERF for organizing this really interesting workshop. I've so much enjoyed the last hour or so. I think it's the best workshop I've attended in a long time. And I think the reason I really like these discussions is because it brings together, while we're all economists, it brings together people who have looked at these political science issues, very carefully and very thoughtfully, and have tried to make sense of them. And I think all too often the debate is suffering from political scientists being naive about economics, and other economists other than us being naive about political science. And then you hear these policy debates where the political scientists say, well, then once the $8 are rolling in, and you go, no, they're not going to roll in the post-war reconstruction period. or the economists say, well, once the all-inclusive peace agreement has been agreed, then we can do whatever it is that economists do or the economy does. And you think, no, this is not going to be such a beautiful peace agreement and power sharing and all that. And I think we are much more nuanced about both sides of the coin. And I think that is realistic and it's helpful and necessary. So that's my starting observation on what we have been discussing so far. Now, being a little bit later in the program, I had the privilege of commenting on the debate before me very briefly on Khalid on the methods question and Mahmoud his very recent questions on the benefits of conflict. And I can't help feel very proud that about 2 hours ago, a paper of mine on which I've worked for several years was accepted finally by the Journal of Peace Research. It's called The Global Economic Burden of Violent Conflict. And we basically showed, together with 3 co-authors, I showed that if the world had been free from conflict since 1960, the average GDP or world GDP would be 12% higher, which you might say is not such a large number. On the other hand, we're arguing that's the order of magnitude that climate change is going to impact our growth. So it is a large burden. But what's really interesting, in my view, are 2 things. One is the methodology here, and maybe that's interesting for you, Khalid, on the work you have shown, which seems very pertinent to what I have calculated here. But to Mahmoud, also, we not just look at the cost of conflict, we also look at the benefits of conflict. And we do that in a sort of cross-country framework. And we find that other countries massively benefit from conflict where military spending is basically a huge Keynesian multiplier. And I'm afraid for our Canadian colleagues listening, Canada is probably the biggest beneficiary of war in the world as a result of American military spending flowing massively across the border into Canada. So I have presented a previous version of this when some Canadian ambassador happened to be in the room that cost me many hours of conviction afterwards to try to persuade him that this was science and not politics. So just to say, it should be online soon, and I'm happy to share a draft if anybody's interested. Now, the project that I helped to organize and guide a little bit along led to another webinar, which is also really good in October last year. And it's about the micro level analysis of the impact of violent conflict on lives and livelihoods in the Mena region. And what was really special about our project is that it picked up many of the discussions we had in specific case studies using quantitative evidence and using quantitative data, survey data mostly, sometimes administrative data. And here's a brief overview. I realize the font is relatively small, but I did want to present an overview. We had different topics. We had displacement and welfare. And of course, displacement, I'll come back to that in a moment, it's a huge topic. We had the role of children, which points to the long-term impacts of conflict and indeed actually probably to the intergenerational impact of conflict. Conflict legacies can be passed on, so to speak, but not just children and displacement, children and war. So children, generally speaking, are a very vulnerable group, and they clearly, aren't the perpetrators. They're the victims of all this. So I think it was worth we spent, we had 4 excellent papers looking at that. And then we had 2 papers in particular from Iraq. So we had a small session on evidence from Iraq, which was also really interesting. It was a very diverse group of researchers based in many different countries, many different continents, even using all sorts of different data, from impact evaluation to large-scale survey data to panel data. And I think there were a couple of lessons to be learned from this project. And I want to briefly summarize those lessons, but then I beg the pardon of the organizers, I will hijack this agenda a little bit. That's the problem if you invite people who know about conflict. They cause trouble and they do and they go off on a tangent. So I'm going to briefly talk about the project, and then I'm going to talk about something else, but I do think it fits to our discussions. And actually, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm glad I took this leap of faith. So the lessons learned from the project include that, first of all, there is a lot of data for the study of the microeconomics of conflict in the Mena region. I must admit, only a few years ago, I thought that the Mena region was data poor, if I can put it that. And I still think it's relatively data poor, but it's not data poor in an absolute sense or in absolute levels. And I think ERF is one of the reasons it's not data poor, the expertise collected and your data archive and so on. And I think that there's more data than is being analyzed. I think maybe it's analysis poor concerning these microeconomic topics. Now, that's one lesson learned, and I think it's an important lesson. And I hope that our project proves, sort of as a proof of concept, that there is valuable research to be done, even if the research is going to be very wide and microeconomic research sometimes, can't answer a big question in a definite way, but it can provide the sort of puzzle pieces that you need in order to start building a narrative. Yeah. But the second point is that conflict, of course, is widespread in the region, but it takes many different forms. The wars in Yemen and Syria are not the same, neither in Libya or Iraq, for example. And of course, there are other forms of conflict as well. The impacts, likewise, are extremely variable. And all of this is just like with other conflicts all around the world. There's, in that sense, no MENA exceptionalism. Yeah, that many of the conflict impacts are very similar to other conflict impacts. So this is a literature that fits right into the general conflict and development literature, which I think is a valuable lesson as well. And the legacies are multidimensional and they're often long lasting. I said that already concerning the children, and especially so for vulnerable groups. And I think that's something to take with us. And it means that even if the fighting stops, the legacies of the war will persist much longer. Now, this begs the question, and this is the point where I'm starting to rebel against just the discussion of the project. If the legacies are long lasting, I started asking myself as the project sort of came to an end, do they create further cycles of violence? So what? So, zooming out, what happens then? Yeah, what's the next step? And so this is what I want to spend the other half of my presentation on. So say violence and conflict occurs in cycles, and if sort of after the war, in many places, unfortunately, is before the war. I mean, all the way back to Paul Collier, we know that the single biggest predictor of future conflict is past conflict. So if that's the case, then is it really worth discussing rebuilding from rubble, or should we instead focus on preventing future war? And the other sort of theme that is coming through here, if displacement is such a big issue, and if it is such a burden, and if it's such a burden both for the displaced, but perhaps also for the hosts, which in countries like Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon, of course, we are discussing only vis-a-vis the Syrian conflict, but of course, there are other forms of displacement as a result of conflict. So if the burden of displacement, both for the displaced and the host, is significant, then does it somehow help sharing the burden? Yeah, and is it, given so many countries host refugees, is it really that high? And if so, and if it is high, would it contribute to further war? So are we basically, I'm almost wondering if with all this microeconomic research, even though I'm a microeconomist myself, are we losing track of the forest to some extent? Yeah, we have beautiful trees now, but where's the forest? And so is it maybe that the risk of resurgence of conflict is the biggest risk? So just very briefly, if that's the case, then here we have the starting point. I've mentioned these countries. We have some countries at war. We have some countries who are hosting refugees, and we have some countries who are not hosting refugees. And so my colleague Neil and I, we started thinking, well, maybe we can make a comparison here. Yeah, so maybe we can look at the developmental consequences of hosting, see how significant that really is, and compare the hosting with the non-hosting countries. It's sort of in the spirit of an impact evaluation. Yeah, first you have parallel trends, and then you have an intervention, an outbreak of conflict, for example, and then you look at the trends beyond that. Or if you like, but it's just very loosely speaking, sort of like what we call a narrative synthetic control analysis, comparing a treated with an untreated group. So let's just have a look at what we find if we do that. And because I don't have much time, I just want to say we looked at all sorts of variables, and we're continuing doing this as work in progress. We look at all sorts of macro country level indicators. I list them here. We check that we have long series, if at all possible. We reorganize the series, we standardize them, we make them look the same so that one number is always, low numbers always good or bad, or, and high numbers the other way around. And we combine them into a single index. Now here we look at all the different indices we found for which we had good data. We see that some series are highly negatively correlated, some positively correlated, some not correlated at all, which suggests that it would be worth aggregating these into an overall index, which is what I'll do in just 5 minutes. But before I do that, I'll show you 5 or 6 individual indicators. GDP per capita growth for the countries that we have. You can see them here. You see our outcomes, and we see that growth is flat, right? GDP per capita growth is flat. We know that there is no significant overall growth if you count for population growth. Highly variable in Iraq, but otherwise even except in Jordan and Lebanon. Yeah, so we see a slight difference there perhaps. But let's look at some other. Sorry, I need to click here. Global Peace Index. Khalid mentioned it earlier. It's quite a useful statistical tool, which has been quite helpful in understanding, and we see quite large differences. It is noisy, it's a noisy indicator, but there's a broad downward trend, especially in Iraq, Egypt, in Turkey. Yeah, and the hosting countries do seem to have a particular trend here. A Human Development Index was also mentioned earlier today. On average, the HDI is improving across the period. That is good. Turkey sees a rapid improvement in its HDI, even at the start of the war in Syria, for reasons which might have nothing to do with the war in itself. But for Jordan and Lebanon, they start ahead of the others, but the gap significantly narrows with the start of the war. So here maybe we see the beginning of the burden that is often hypothesized, and we can narrow it down to these particular indicators within the Human Development Index, life expectancy, education, etc. Here, if we just look at incomes, it's less data. So for shorter periods, we've seen adverse deterioration in Jordan and Lebanon with the start of the Syrian war. That's quite strong and marked. High variation in Iraq, but that's a strong contrast to the other countries. So these are probably some of the findings that'll drive my chart that I'll show in a moment. And just one more individual indicator, maternal mortality. Again, the deterioration in Jordan and Lebanon in the context of the Syrian war, quite unlike in other countries, although noteworthy the high variation in Iraq. So we see the different series move in different ways. Now I show my messiest picture. If you put all the different countries together, you see that Jordan and Lebanon are up there, which is good, but the growth is slowing. By contrast, the other trends seem to be improving despite a lot of variability. Now, if we aggregate this all together to get a clear story, you get this picture. And I think this picture tells a very strong story, a very powerful story in my view. So we have, on the one hand, this what we call the control countries, like if you think of synthetic control, red, right? So the other countries who don't host refugees, who have a positive trend, starting off at a lower level, but a positive trend which continues after the start of the Syrian war. Then you have the treatment countries, the host countries for Syrian refugees, who have a parallel trend. They're higher than the other countries, but that's okay from our analytical point of view. But they have basically parallel trend up to 2010, which then is a structural break, and you have first a stalling of the break and then actually deterioration. So you have a divergence of the trends and a clear difference, a reversal in fortunes for the host countries from 2010 onwards. Yes? Shall I slow down? I'll slow down a little bit, but I'm actually almost done. So this is our key finding, which I think summarizes much of the story of what we have discussed before quite neatly. So we see clearly a decline in the indicators, especially for Jordan and Lebanon. They seem to be particularly affected, well, as also was said earlier by Khalid, I think, either by the hosting of the refugees or by the geopolitics of the Syrian war and all that it entails, including sanctions most recently. And yet both countries do remain better off than some of the other countries. We only have data at this point until 2018. And since then, of course, we have seen other developments which have further, whether you call it an explosion or an implosion in Lebanon, an implosion, I guess, of political structures, but perhaps not as much as almost would be useful for rebirth of the political system, COVID-19, the geopolitics, etc. So what does that imply for the future? I have one final slide, and I hope I can basically finish on time. This is the outlook. Will Lebanon follow in Syria's path? Here, I plotted Gallup data on life satisfaction, which is actually an incredibly simple and powerful tool, beyond GDP and all the other variables for measuring how people feel about their country. And I just aligned time-wise, I mixed the years so that for Syria, the last year is 2011. And for Lebanon, the last year that I had available at the time is 2019. So if you mix these years like that, aligning the last available year just as the crisis erupted in Syria, with just as things heated up in Lebanon, you see a strong and significant decline over the preceding years. And this gets me really worried, and this makes me think that perhaps we do see a pre-war period in Lebanon now rather than a post-war period in Lebanon. And this does, I think, give credence to the idea that there may be cycles of violence, and rather than trying to consider rebuilding from war, what we really have to focus on stopping the next round of the war. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to our discussion. And again, I'm so grateful to the organizers for this fascinating project and workshop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tilman. And I'm going to suggest that you translate this into Arabic and let the authorities understand what's going on. The commentator is Nada Mustafa Ali. And Nada, would 5 minutes do, because we're running behind time? Would 5 minutes do, Nada?
I think so, yeah. I will time myself.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Hey, thank you so much to ERF and partners for organizing this important symposium. And thank you so much, Dr. Tilman Brück, for this presentation. My name is Nada Mustafa Ali, and I teach at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and I'm originally from Sudan. Thank you so much for an insightful analysis and presentation, Dr. Brück. And of course, you used quantitative research methods. I use qualitative research methods in my research, and I'm going to, draw some or shed some light on the importance of also complementing quantitative research with qualitative research. I think you came up with really important conclusions, and I appreciate the conclusions that you added, or the insights that you added in your presentation, particularly that legacies of conflict are multidimensional and long-lasting, especially for marginalized or vulnerable groups. And then your questions regarding, whether legacies contribute to further cycles of violence or new cycles of violence. And drawing on my own research in Sudan and South Sudan, especially the latter, I would say that legacies of conflict do contribute to recreating violence or creating new cycles of violence. And that is why it is really important after signing a peace agreement to address the root causes of the conflict for us to be able to prevent this violence. These conclusions are from the paper you shared, and I think you presented many of them here. In the interest of time, I'm going to just make some suggestions, very brief suggestions. One, I think what you shared with us is really important, is extremely insightful, but I think interdisciplinary research might illuminate the refugee experience and the impact of, forced displacement on host countries and communities further. And I would like to say that, for example, both refugees and displaced populations on one hand and host communities on the other are gendered, racialized, and are embedded in other hierarchies, including those of social class, for example, and it depends on the region itself. And of course, you do take this into account. I am really grateful that you, for example, use the gender equality and the maternal gender equality index and maternal mortality ratio in making your conclusions. But how about also thinking about the actual experiences and narratives of refugee populations and host communities as well? Especially that I understand that you use the SDGs to frame your work. And, obviously both gender inequality and equalities in general are part and parcel of this agenda. But I think a narrative, like integrating the narratives of refugees and the narratives of populations in host communities would, add actually to the strength of your paper. Another suggestion, and you might already be doing that, except, maybe it did not come up in the presentation, is, how about taking into account refugees' contributions and agency without, of course, romanticizing refugees and forcibly displaced populations. I have in mind, for example, the experiences of Syrian refugees in Sudan. This is not based on actual research, systematic research, but based on my own observations, for example, and with on interviews for other purposes. But many of the Syrian, the Syrians who fled the war to Sudan have started their own businesses there. They created their restaurants or interior design companies. And in that way, they are contributing positively to the economy. Again, the exodus of Sudanese, for example, to Egypt, both from Sudan and South Sudan and Kenya in the 1980s, actually created in large numbers, created opportunities for organizing and for developing a strong civil society that has played important roles, actually, that is playing important roles now as we proceed with the transitional period in Sudan. In Kenya, the presence of South Sudanese refugees. Again, there were many civil society organizations, including those created by women. When I carried out my doctoral research there in 1999, I'll take half a minute more, okay? But there was a whole industry, built around humanitarianism in Kenya. There was a whole airport in Kenya that tended to the needs of Sudanese refugees, for example, South Sudanese refugees in Kenya. And I want to suggest that we change the terms of the discourse about refugee communities, for example. And I want to suggest that oftentimes this opens up spaces for alternative policies that might see refugees as human capital rather than as a problem. And I'm saying this while, having been a refugee actually in the United Kingdom. I applied for political asylum, and I believe that I had contributed, in many ways to that particular community. But systematic research, of course, is important. And thank you again for the invitation to comment on this important paper.
Thank you so much, Nada. This is very, very, very interesting. And I'm sure that Tillman will take your comments very seriously into account. I'm going to have 5 minutes for possible discussion and discussion on this topic.
There's one hand raised from Dr. Mahmoud Haddad again. Yes.
And anyone else, Shireen?
Not so far, no.
Okay. Mahmoud, where's Mahmoud?
I don't know, but Dr. Nader Qabbani.
Can you hear me?
Oh.
Yeah, Mahmoud. Yes, go ahead, Mahmoud.
Shukran Khair. Thank you very much, you guys. But one comment is, when I look at investment in military spending, I look at it not as an investment, as a consumption. And I don't know how that can be different than if we took the fund and invested in infrastructure rather than invested in producing military tools, equipment, whatever we're going to call that. That's one thing that I don't know if that is a cost or benefit to the economy in general. The second thing that I really have a question about when we look at cost and benefit out of any given war, do you think that countries create war in order to get out of certain economic stagnation or decline or what have you? So in purpose, they enter into war in order to get themselves out of economic problems, if you will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Anyone else?
Dr. Nader Qabbani.
Nader, briefly, Nader, please.
Yes, no, thanks so much to Tillman for taking this conversation off in a separate direction. When I saw his last slide on life satisfaction, my heart sank. In 2010, I actually had access to Gallup World Poll data, but we didn't actually look at life satisfaction. And I only saw that graph 2 years later when it was too late for Syria. Seeing it for Lebanon now just raised a very, very unpleasant specter. I had a quick question about the index. I know that it's you bring a lot of information together. Is there any way you can sparse out what's going on, what's driving this? Is it lack of, basically closing of trade routes? Is it burden of social services for the host communities? Or is it the host communities' reluctance to open up their economy to integrate refugees more economically into their things? And since Khalid is on the panel, I'd like to draw him out into the conversation because he's looked at this as much as anybody, if not more, about the effect of refugees on host communities, and maybe he can weigh in. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to give the floor now to Tillman. Tillman.
Thank you very much, Samir and Nada, for excellent comments. Thank you so much. I appreciate them very much. And I wondered if you could share the slides with me by email. That would be lovely. And also for Mahmoud and Nada for your comments. Let me just be very selective, and I apologize, but I think we don't have much time. So I just want to give a very brief response to something from each of your comments. And actually, they're all almost tied together, especially maybe the last and the first points. About viewing refugees as having agency, I think that's critically important. I couldn't disagree less. So I think it's really important. One interesting point is sort of what's the reference category? Yeah. So I often think, even though it's a case of forced displacement in many cases, it may still be that the slightly more entrepreneurial people, leave earlier, and some people may be just even more attached to their land, or even more, or even less mobile for whatever reason. It could be health reasons, it could be cultural reasons, it could be lack of information, lack of money. We've recently done a study for UNHCR, and where people got in Ethiopia, where people got cash grants. They went home to South Sudan, where they got in-kind help. They had to stay, so they were cash constrained from returning. They wanted to return, but they couldn't. So, and likewise with fleeing. I mean, it's costly. You can't just flee. So there are all sorts of reasons. Northern Uganda, we saw people, after the end of the war, if they had children, they stayed in the camps because they wanted the urban infrastructure, they wanted the schools and the healthcare, for their kids. So all sorts of reasons why you may or may not leave, or why you may or may not return. But what is the comparison group? Is it the people who stay behind? Is it the host population? Is it people in other areas where there aren't any refugees? There's so many possible comparisons to make. So I think that's important. And I think the other thing is the politics of it, and the instrumentalization of, terms like refugee crisis, refugee flows. There's bitter politics, nasty politics associated with it on all sides, and that makes it very difficult. So the very related point is the drivers of what we see with this index. What Neda asked about, I am wondering. I can't show it with the data, but I'm wondering if it's the relatively rapid change, the relatively rapid transformation of Syria into a country that didn't see war, into a country that saw war, and then what we have heard several times, the bureaucratic sort of burden and the strong state in many MENA countries, and the inability to adapt. Both the inability of the Syrian state to adapt, and which then relates to Ahmed's question, the use of war as a strategy for not coping. So I think that's very clear. Syria is a very sad but good example of that. If the regime had been more adaptable, it might have found a non-violent strategy for adapting with end of oil revenues and lack of legitimacy and so on. But it didn't. And so if you radicalize, and if you go to the extreme, then you don't need to change as much. So it's almost like a paradox. So by radicalizing, you can continue, whereas if you don't radicalize, if you stay sort of in the middle, mid-center ground, you have to move more. So that sounds paradoxical, but I think that's my view of how it is. And so the inability of certain states to transform themselves meant you had to have violent regime change or war in multiple MENA countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Tilman. Neda, is there anything you would like to add, Neda?
Maybe I could make one point. Thank you so much for these comments, and I agree with you. And I think, regarding your questions about, again, methodology and comparisons and so on, this is the value for the value of ethnographic research, for example. And it could be a strategy, or a methodological strategy that would complement the kind of research that you are carrying out. Thank you.
Thank you, Neda. So now I'm sorry, we have to move into the last session on economic interdependence. And Ahmed Onaim, would you please make your presentation?
Hello, Dr. Samir. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be the last speaker. I know people are tired, so I'll be brief. And Ramash, can we please share the presentation?
Yes, of course.
This is a work in the pipeline. It's still not finished. I have the pleasure to have a number of colleagues from ERF, colleagues and friends from ERF, as well as others from outside. They are mainly Khalid Sekat, Ibrahim Saif, and Muhammad Marwani, as well as people from outside like Kasia from CASE in Poland. And the whole idea revolves around many issues that have been discussed in this session. So the main title of the project is Economic Interdependence and Conflict. And here are some ideas. Can we move, Ramaj? Yeah. The project is mainly divided into 4 papers, and they discuss different issues like the theoretical underpinnings between economic interdependence and conflict. And here comes the issue of what kind of relationship are we talking about? What kind of causality is it there? Is it positive or negative? In the mind setup of many of the people, they think that based on the EU experience since its inception, that more or less economic interdependence in the form of regional trade agreements will definitely lessen more the conflict. And that was the whole idea behind establishing the European community at that time. Yet the empirical evidence and the literature review of so many colleagues all over the world showed that this is not always the case. So that's one of the issues that we're discussing. Another issue is the term economic interdependence. And I've been following what has been said in all the presentations and the comments and discussions and questions. And here comes another issue. It was only Ibrahim al-Badawi who mentioned economic interdependence in the form of regional integration. But what we are trying to find out that it's not always the case. There are other forms of economic interdependence in the form of investment, in the form of trade and services, in the form of what has been said, just mentioned by Tillman and Nada, the issue of movement of labor, which is another kind of economic interdependence. But this project so far has focused on regional trade agreements as a proxy for economic interdependence. This is a limitation, but that's according to the size of the project and the number of the papers. That was our issue. Another issue is the direction of causality. As I said, it's not always positive, and there are so many evidence that shows that this has not always been the case. So we're trying to dip deeper in this issue and discuss what kind of things are we talking about. And then we take the status of Arab region. Definitely the focus is on the Arab region. And we try to find out what's going in there. Is it a matter of positive or negative relationship? But once we start to discuss this, so many other issues pop out, like the issue of whether we're talking about conflict in the region, whether we're talking about national conflict, whether we're talking about intra-regional or inter-regional type of conflict, whether we're talking about Arab exceptionalism in that regard. And when I mention here Arab exceptionalism, I don't mention it as we always do as a kind of a slogan that we're always different, but in this case specifically, we are different in many regards. And there are so many reasons to be different. Number one, for example, Tillman mentioned, and he was saying it's a humble number, the 12% of GDP, which is the cost if there is no any other kind of conflict in the world. We have been the word GDP would have been greater or more by 12%. Now, just to give you some examples, Iraq by itself alone, in some of the recent years after Saddam Hussein, and if I'm talking about terrorism, which is again, if we are going to define conflict, we need to take into account terrorism. In 1 year, it has costed more than 30% of its GDP. So definitely, if you look at the World Terrorism Report, we will find that the Arab region is number one, ranking number one in many of the cases. And there is a kind of special case for Arab countries in this regard. Whether we're talking about the kind of conflicts, we have all the types of conflicts in the region, whether we're talking about the national, whether we're talking about the inter-region, whether we're talking about the inter-regional, whether we're talking about domestic, whether we're talking about so many types of conflict in this regard. So that's another issue that we're trying to get deeper in it and to differentiate between what type of conflict we're talking about and the impact and the relationship with economic interdependence as proxied by regional trade agreements. Ramesh, can we move? We're trying to explain why is this the case? Is it a matter of we lack the conflict management mechanism? And when we're talking about intra-regional trade agreements, and here we focus on PAFTA, and I leave this to Ibrahim Saif, my colleague and friend, who is actually focusing on this issue. Is it a matter of shallow versus deepness? So we might have some kind of economic interdependence in theory by the regional trade agreements, but in reality, in practice, it's not there because it's not deep. So this might create some kind of less economic interdependence, which is because the design of the regional trade agreement itself, and hence conflict is easy to be there. And we have a case of Qatar recently with the Gulf area and with Egypt. So this is two cases that we have in mind. The role of oil and natural gas, do they play a role to lessen the dependence? The role of regional trade agreements with other non-regional partners. So Marwani, for example, in his paper with his colleague, they found out that whenever there is an agreement with, for example, the EU, this increases the possibility of conflicts within the region because there is less dependence among the countries in the region. So we have so many interesting questions that we would have loved to go deeper in it, but again, the limitation of the papers, the limitation of the size of the paper and the time did not allow us to get in such issues. And then we focus always on the Arab specificity in this regard, trying to find if there is Arab exceptionalism. Ramaj, please, can we move further? Papers in the pipeline, those are the titles of the papers or what we are trying to investigate, and I'm putting the names of my colleagues and friends. What does the literature tell us on the relationship between economic interdependence and conflict management? And this represents more or less the theoretical framework for the whole project. And then we go into the two direction or the causality direction of causality. Marwani and his co-author, they are investigating the impact of economic interdependence on conflict management. And then Sikad just does the reversal, investigating the influence of conflict on economic interdependence. Finally, we have Ibrahim, who is trying to focus on the institutions and the role in enhancing economic interdependence and lessening conflict management. And Ibrahim is focusing mainly on institutions as designed by the PAFTA or the Pan-Arab Free Trade Area, trying to find out what's going on in this regard. Is it the culprit, or there are other reasons that could have been the reason behind such conflicts arising, despite we have the form of economic interdependence as proxied by the regional trade agreements. Yes, Ramaj, please. Several issues remain unaddressed. Those are the role of domestic conflicts. We did not focus on them. We focus mainly on the conflicts between the countries, but Khaled Sikat is focusing as well a little bit in his regression model on domestic conflicts. Rising of deglobalization moves. It's an issue that we should take into account, and this is another project that maybe ERF should focus on. What is the future of globalization and regional economic integration and economic interdependence, which is actually has been affected as well by COVID-19. So again, that's an issue that we want to focus on, especially after the Brexit. The future of global and regional value chains, since they are now being redesigned, what will happen in this regard, and whether this will enhance or lessen the economic interdependence among Arab countries in the form of conflicts arising. And finally, the difference between regional and non-regional conflicts. Among the issues also that I mentioned, having such lovely papers in the pipeline, for me, does not address the main issue, which is we have to have this in one synthesis paper. So if we want to pass a message to a policymaker or the community in large, and they don't have the time or they don't have the ability to read all the papers in depth, then such kind of projects definitely need some kind of synthesis paper, which gives the main lessons as well as policy briefs. Ramaj, please. That was the main issues. I hope I did not prolong. I know we exceeded the time, so I meant to keep it short and just to tell you that there are so many issues unaddressed, despite it's an interesting project, but we found out that still a lot needs to be addressed in the future. Thank you so much, Samir. Thank you so much, Ibrahim and Shireen.
Thank you, Ahmed, very much, Ahmed, and hopefully we look forward to completing the project at hand. Ibrahim.
Yes,
Ibrahim
Dr. Samir.
Please, shall we have your comments on Ahmed's presentation?
Thank you, Dr. Samir. Indeed, my comments on Ahmed's work, it's rather, I would say, complementary in a way, because I am part of the team that is looking into this. Although I focus on the institutional aspect, but I remember last time you also were with us when we addressed the first draft of the 4 papers, in which I must admit that we still are not having, I would say, a unified conclusion regarding the directions of the relation between interdependence, as we defined it, and the conflict prevention, for that matter. So this is the relations. The more examples, the more countries that you look at, the mixed, it's quite mixed outcome that we're having. But one thing that is we're quite sure about is that the more interdependence, not only in terms of having trade agreements or investment agreement to that effect, but the more relations, the more effective relations that you have amongst and between countries, then it could be or less likely that the opportunity cost of having a conflict is increasing, and therefore then it's quite favorable to have this, because, and here we went into the wealth, where is the wealth originated, and what are the role of the domestic stakeholders within respective countries that we are examining, which is in our case the Arab countries. The wider the constituency within the countries that are promoting regional trade or regional integration, the mostly effective within their countries in order to at least rationalize the decisions when it comes to emerging conflict within the region. Of course, Ahmed already mentioned Qatar as part of the GCC, but we know that it's been part of it, but the intra-regional regional trade relations between GCC countries is quite limited, because most of these countries originated their wealth outside that paradigm. So that's also could justify why such solid block for over 20 years is sort of, or even more, has all of a sudden have that rupture within, and how it was emerged. So in our case also, we cannot undermine and overlook the political also implications and the political attitudes and behavior within these countries when it comes to the level of trading, investment, regional trade arrangements. So that's one thing. I in particularly examined the institutional aspect, and we looked at some of in details into whether what is the Arab League has been doing, what are other regional trade, GAFTA and other, and we found few interesting issues related to the functionality of these arrangements, how operable they are, and to what extent they look into the details and mechanisms for enforcement. And of course, the issue related to the governance within the respective countries that we are talking about. And we found that no matter how many arrangements you have, if there is no proper enforcement mechanism embedded within this agreement, then it's prone to be exposed, and it's quite vulnerable to any kind of conflict. The other factor, which might be outside that paradigm, is that the region is quite penetrated in terms of the international relations. I mean, it's been influenced by external factors that also impacted the internal or the regional dynamics to that effect, which makes the analysis even more complicated. In conclusion, Dr. Samir, I know I'm the last to speak in that respect, is that this sub-regional trade arrangements are quite important in at least outlining what are the commonalities, what are the mutual benefits that could emerge and out of this, and also finding mechanisms for parties to be addressed, to discuss, and hopefully reach at the end of the day to a certain conclusion regarding how this conflict or how this arrangement can help in preventing the conflict. But if you ask me if there is a clear-cut conclusion in our exercise. That was not the case, because we looked at mixed experiences with mixed outcomes that emerge out of this. We leave it there, and it's still work in progress, but we hope to conclude soon and to come up with the synthesis report that Ahmed is developing. Thank you, Dr. Samir.
Many thanks. I'm going to devote 5 to 10 minutes for any possible discussion, questions, comments. So please, those who would like to comment, go ahead.
I don't see hands.
Any hands?
Oh, one is just come up from Dr. Anis.
Okay, let her go ahead. From whom?
Dr. Anis.
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And Anis from the University of Bahrain. Thank you very much, everyone. Please, I'm not a specialist in the field, but I would like to ask a general question about the conflict. Do you think that conflict is an economic necessity? Because, you know, if I look at the case of Iraq, for instance, the case of the conflict in Iraq, so suddenly there is a conflict in Iraq without any reason, and then we see that there are millions of people, of Iraqi scientists abroad. So just a question about the origin of conflict, the fundamental question about the essence of conflict. Is it related to economic aspect? You know, this is just a general question, just about the essence of conflict. Is it, yes, do you think that this is related to economic issues or to political, or? So this is my question about the origin of conflict.
Thank you, Anis. I think this question is addressed to all the panelists, to all the speakers. Would anybody like to volunteer a comment on this question?
I can start, Samir, with it, just having some done work on terrorism. It's $1 million question, because it's more or less similar to what are the origins of terrorism. Is it economic? Is it political? Is it religious, or what have you? So it's the same more or less of conflict. They might arise from different reasons, yet they have consequences on all fronts, whether they are political, social, or economic. So each case has its own origin, own roots that no generalization can be given. I hope I just answered.
Thank you, Ahmed. Any other of the panelists would like to comment?
Can I just quickly on this also? I fully agree with what Ahmed just said. I mean, our analysis of the conflicts in various situations would give different weights to different factors. But I would argue that a systemic association between poor initial conditions related to governance, issues particularly related to rule of law, accountability, and participation. These are the key, I think, common factors that are there. Now, when you combine this poor governance infrastructure with another situation of rising basic human capital and human development indicators, particularly secondary education, and therefore the expectations that are coming with a more youthful generation that are met by a complete stalemate in the economic system because of the rentier political economy, and then exacerbated by deeply rooted inequalities because of reasons that were mentioned earlier, then you really have all the perfect ingredients for conflict. This is, I think, it just takes a small trigger. It doesn't matter what, it's a small trigger for conflict. But these are the structural issues, I think, that our research has identified in most of the conflict cases, at least in the region. Over to you.
Thank you, Khalid. Anyone else? Well, I think that we have come to the end now. This has been a very, very rich session that has addressed aspect of the conflict, the reasons for the conflict, the impact of the conflict, and how we can go in the future based on the research that has been done. Brahim, I suggest that what we should do now is actually to synthesize the major conclusions of these various 4 projects to come out with a grand statement, a grand document about conflict, the impact of the conflict, and how this can show the way for the region to more peaceful and productive. So let me thank the
Samir,
panelists.
can I say something before you conclude?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to underscore what you said, that actually there is a great opportunity actually to generate policy briefs and blogs based on the finding of this research. As you said, to synthesize the 4 components of this research. But I just wanted to say that in the case of the discussion about not just regional integration, but regional cooperation in general, regional cooperation and conflicts. I think many observers now, researchers are predicting the Mena region will experience huge tension on sharing water resources, especially international water courses. And the Nile Basin is not only the one, but there are others, and so actually this is going to be an important research that I think will be extension to the research that Ahmad Ghunaim is currently coordinating, and I think this is an area that we need to look at. The other area is that the ACLED data shows very clearly that the original research that Paul Collier and yourself, Samir, and myself, and others, and Ramindo have contributed to in the early 2000s and late 1990s, about that social diversity is not necessarily a root cause of the conflicts, because you need large-scale violence, and then collective action is a problem, and so the loot factors and the grievance factor and so on. But now, more recently, as we saw in Libya and Iraq and Syria, that actually you can have very large, intensive violence, localized violence, in certain localities within a country as a result of loot factors, as well as grievance factor by small minorities or associated with terrorism and so on. And I think this links to the Tillman Brooks research, and I think it would be great, Tillman, is that we actually build a database that can actually be harmonized and as part of this project to the researchers. And then again, I would say also that Nada's comments about studying, zooming in an ethnographic kind of social, anthropological kind of perspective, to study these small communities and what they are going through in terms of their views and their experiences and so on. That would be, I think, another important. And then finally, I would say we need also to study the determinants of peaceful uprisings and how the transformation that peaceful uprising takes either continue to be peaceful, leading to a certain outcome, or it gets transformed into a violent conflict. This is another important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. So now let me conclude by expressing a great appreciation, thanks to the speakers and the discussions, and to all those who participated, and hopefully will be with you very, very soon. Good night, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Zamir.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. Pleasure seeing you all.
And thank you, Shireen, of course.
And
Shireen,
Dr.
thanks.
Samir, Dr. Zamir,
Yeah.
for Dr. Ibrahim, I want him to also keep in mind energy sector and the conflict on gas and gas findings in the Mediterranean as one of the sources of attention. But that's another subject. I just want to allude to this, and then we can discuss it at some point. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you
Bye,
all.
everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Steve.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.